And if we can recapture or continue to promote that not forgotten Dixie spirit, then the world becomes a better place, little bit by little bit. And that was what Coach Lynn was about.
Oh, once I lived in Cottonwood and owned a little farm. When they called me down to Dixie, it caused me much alarm. To hoe the cane and cotton, I right away must go. But the reason why they sent me, I'm sure I do not know.
Welcome to Not Forgotten, a podcast brought to you by the Doc Booth Foundation and hosted by noted writer Lyman Hafen, who has chronicled the stories, culture, and character of Utah's Dixie for more than 40 years.
It's always a great day in Dixie, but today, even though it's 109 degrees out there, it's an especially great day because I've got two great fellows in the studio with us today, Nate Staheli and Lynn Christensen, two of the great men of this area, two of the really what I would call spark plugs of, dare I say, the Dixie Spirit, even though they are Pineview boys. We talk about this Dixie Spirit, and a lot of times we tie that to Dixie High School, but Dixie High School was started in 1911, and come 1984, 70-some-odd years later, there's another high school in Utah's Dixie, and it's Pineview, and it's an amazing high school with amazing students. And that was a real key point in our community's history to go from one high school to two, and for that high school to be able to create its own identity, its own spirit, a spirit born out of the Dixie Spirit, but very much its own, and that identity. And these two gentlemen, Nate and Jed, embody that. And we want to talk about the embodiment of that by talking about Jed's father, Lynn Christensen, the legendary coach at Pineview. He happens to also be Nate's uncle, and both of them played for him, and both of them have amazing experiences and things to share. So let's dive in. Nate, I'm going to start with you. Tell us who your uncle is.
I'll affectionately refer to him as Coach. Uncle Lynn, Coach Lynn, married my dad's sister, Jeannie. And two of the most amazing, hardworking, selfless individuals you'll ever meet. They come from good families on both sides. Coach Lynn was from Cache Valley. Aunt Jeannie here from good old southern Utah and Dixie. And great parents, great leaders, and most of all, just great examples to us as individuals. I think on a personal note, I'm going to go right to it. Dad was taken in a farming accident early when I was 14 years old, and I needed people in my life. And Coach Lynn immediately stepped in to help, not replace, but to help support and fill that role as a father figure, and he did many times. But Coach Lynn, again, I'm going to call him Coach Lynn because to me he was coach. He was my uncle, but he was coach. And you talk about legendary. I think it's the Sandlot movie. Heroes get remembered, but legends never die. He was a legend and will always be a legend.
And we're going to learn more about what that legend means. Jed, you're Lynn Christensen's son. He was also your coach. Tell us about your dad and your coach.
Growing up, I got to spend countless hours in locker rooms and on fields and whatever. Probably from the time I was 6 years old, I for sure remember. And growing up, seeing all these individuals that he had touched. Nate talks about Dad being a father figure to him. Didn't replace. I 100%, as Nate was saying that, I'm shaking my head, yes. Dad thought of Nate as a son as well, and he wasn't trying to replace a father, was trying to step in and help out. But I look at all the years, like I say, that I got to spend in those locker rooms and to see how many lives he touched. I tell people all the time, I would get to listen to letters that individuals, players had sent to Dad when they were out on missions or just even had started careers, families, whatever, and writing letters back because he would read those all the time in the locker room and stuff. And thousands and thousands of lives that he touched and helped. So I got to see a little bit of a different side than a lot of other people, like I say, because of bus rides and all the time spent on the court, on the field, different things. And Dad was always happy to let me be there and whatever. I'm sure more than once I got in the way and I probably got my butt kicked for it, but I really enjoyed all that time that I got to be there. So
You were the oldest child?
So I've got an older sister.
An older sister.
Yep, and I'm the oldest boy.
And then the other siblings?
So then I've got another sister just younger than me, a brother 4 years younger, another sister, Joy, that had passed away, and then a younger brother. So there's three boys, 3 girls, and we were all about 2 years apart. Wow. So
that's awesome. But you being the first born, you got to tag along a lot, I'm sure.
I did. Like I said, I'm sure with a whole house full of kids, it made it easy for Mom to kick me onto the bus to go on bus trips and different stuff just to get one more out of her hair and whatever there.
We're going to talk more about your mom too, Jeannie. What a great lady. And I might just mention that both Jeannie and Lynn have passed away in very recent months. And I know that's a very soft spot for you, Jed, and really for all of us because they were so beloved in this community. Pineview High School came into being in 1984. That was the first graduating class. But you're talking about when you're younger. Where was your family prior to that?
He originally started and was a couple years doing some stuff in Ogden, and then there was a position opened in Hurricane for a coach down there. So my first memories are from over to Hurricane, just because that's about when I could start to remember and like I say, got to go and do. One of my biggest favorite is when they won the state championship over there, the first state championship for Hurricane in basketball. And I remember getting to walk out onto the Marriott Center, the floor and stuff, and standing out thinking I was pretty cool because I was out on the court because I got to go tag along. So he went there in 77 maybe, 76, 77. But then when Pineview opened that 83, 84 year, came over.
So your dad, being who he was, he probably could have gone about anywhere. He would have been welcomed probably anywhere. What brought him here? I think I know that answer, but...
There were some ties down here, and that was where he had met Mom, was when he was down here. He played at Dixie and played several sports at the college. Still call it Dixie College.
We can all relate. We relate a little more specifically that way.
Yeah. And then Mom went up to school to Utah State for a couple of years, and he was finishing up some stuff. He went to Weber State and played a couple more years of athletics up there. But he was tired of the snow, and he really did love this area down here. And with the ties with the family, it was a natural drawing point to bring him back down this way.
I'm sure that was altogether fine with your mom.
She was very grateful to be coming back home again, too. Yes.
That's awesome. The Staheli family that your father married into already had this amazing legacy in athletics, especially at Dixie College. Maybe Nate could set that up for us a little bit.
Yeah, I'd like to make a little bit of a comment on that. The Staheli family, my dad actually played there a little bit, had a compound fracture, so he ended up not finishing his collegiate career, but Uncle Stan and Uncle George and Uncle Ralph, I think, even participated a little bit. And so there was this little bit of a legacy that was there, but you talk about coming into the Staheli family and Coach Lynn moving back in. I think this might be just maybe it's folklore, but there's got to be some validity to it. They were playing one day as a family over the Armory, I believe, and Coach Lynn in his infinite wisdom decided he was going to contest a call or do something that was out of the norm. And my dad was sitting on the bench there, and it started to get a little contentious. And so Dad jumped off the bench and cold-cocked him. And dropped him on the ground and says, listen, we're not going to have any of that, but it's just like any Staheli function. You have those activities that happen. The next thing you do, you go get a Pepsi and talk about it. But I think that was part of his welcoming to the family, if you will. I don't know, Jed, I don't know if that's the true story or not.
I've heard it just that way as well. So there was more than a fight or two and stitches and some different stuff.
But on that note with that, and we'll maybe go back into the college scene a little bit of it with it, Coach Lynn was notorious for, in my opinion, letting you know where you were and where you stood, but more importantly, what you could become. I remember one time after a game, he says, I've never done this to anybody. And I was young. I think it might have been a sophomore starting for him playing. But he said to me, he says, I've never done this in all my years of coaching. It's the first time I'm ever going to do this. He says, I'm blaming that loss on you. He looked me in the eye. He says, sometimes it's the officials. As a matter of fact, most of the time it's the officials, he quipped. But he says, and sometimes it's a combination. He says, but it was you. You had 3 mistakes in a row right there. And I thought to myself, how dare you? That's not all my fault. But yet, in that next breath, he said, I love you, and I know what you will do for this team. Let's move on. Never talked about it ever again, but went on with it. And he was notorious at the college. He played multiple sports. And my point was, he was extremely athletic, but I think more than his athleticism was his commitment and desire to be a competitor and to be good at what he did. So he accepted all challenges. And it was evident in I believe he's in the Hall of Fame at Dixie College, and it's just a legend that transcends it.
That competitive spirit is what I remember most about Coach Lynn, just that innate in his DNA, that competitive spirit, which you can be a person out here in the community and be that person, but when you step onto that floor or onto that field or onto that sideline, that something kicks in there, and it's really powerful. And I learned to understand that and also to appreciate and respect it. I still want to circle back a little bit more because your grandma Staheli, Karma, I would call her the matriarch of Washington and one of the most amazing people I've ever known. And I feel like I knew her pretty well because when I was a little kid, I was her nephew. I still am her nephew, but I always felt so good in her presence, and I loved the way that she treated me. I loved her warmth and her kindness and her interest, but I also experienced and saw her competitive spirit when she stepped across that line into the arena of competition. And that's an amazing thing that I think comes down through the DNA on both sides of your family, Jed, that is pretty special. And I tie so much of that back to that Dixie Spirit, that feeling of we're down here in the sticks and we're making it work and we're going to figure it out, but we can beat you guys. We can play with you guys and we can beat you. And we're just as good as you. And I think that comes out of that beautiful spirit.
And to your point, there's 2 sides of the equation in this beautiful relationship with Coach Lynn and Aunt Jeannie. One was Aunt Jeannie and one was Coach Lynn. And they were matchsticks at times. They exploded in certain situations, but they were the first to quickly step back away and recognize the personal relationships. I don't think Coach Lynn ever really cared about the worldly accolades per se, and even what a lot of people would think about him, but he did care. He did care about the one. And as we talked earlier, I would say all of his players, I'll go that far to say all of his players, recognized him as a father figure in certain regards. Sometimes they didn't like him all the time because of his truthfulness or approach to it or whatever it might be, but they both came from that Dixie Spirit attitude of we can do. We have what we have. Let's make the best of what we have, and let's overcome whatever challenge comes in front of us. And individually we can't do it, but collectively we can. There were times in ball games he would convince us that we could beat any team in the world. And we actually thought we could. You step away from that, there's not a chance we beat that team. And he would have coaches on the other side come up and say, I don't know how you did it. And he would always deflect it back to the kids and said, you know what? They believe in this charisma that we've got, this certain intangible that he created, helped create with this family atmosphere, if you will. He was probably one of the most misunderstood coaches I've ever been around or played because people just misunderstood him. They only seen certain aspects of him. One quick story was a player from Hurricane when Coach Lynn had an open heart surgery, and the kid came in to see him in the hospital and said, miracles do happen. And Coach Lynn said, what are you talking about? He says, all these years I never thought you had a heart, but apparently you have one. Open heart surgery. But anyway.
Wow. Jed, take us back, and Nate, you'll be able to give perspective to this too, but take us back to a time when there was one high school in this greater community, and then there were two. And what was that? From the athletic or competitive side, what did that mean?
I remember when that high school first opened and it was a split, and where was the boundary split going to be? And you had a lot of kids from the Green Valley area. That's what came to Pineview, and then the Washington. And so you still had a lot of the really downtown, everything was still Dixie area. And then it was just a circle of everything out around, like the St. George proper area is what went to Pineview. And for those first few years there, I think for the most part, Dixie was taking it to Pineview there a little bit. And as a few years into it and it got to where it was a lot of the athletes, the people, kids that he had been like bringing up through the program, and all of a sudden Pineview turns into a powerhouse down here. And he always loved that battle with Dixie, and there was nothing greater than when we had won and you wanted to go to the Frost Top. Because when you had beat Dixie, they didn't want to see you there. And so it was always fun to go there, drive up and down the boulevard a little bit. That was when there was hardly any car. The cars on it were all locals, and people knew that you were driving up and down it. But yeah, you didn't even have to go in there to get anything. It was just driving in there so that people knew you were there. But that competitive, I think that's what actually helped make both schools so much better as well, is because there became that rivalry. But I'm sure Nate's the same way. Man, I had so many great buddies at Dixie. I went to school with them for a lot of years, and then all of a sudden the split. When I'm going to Pineview, they're going to Dixie. But then we would play later in the summer. We would be on teams together again and hanging out through the summertime. And so still had such a great bond and relationship with a lot of those guys. And we knew that once the game was over and whatever, you were fighting tooth and nail with them. But as soon as the game was over, you were back buddies again. So it was, and like I say, I think they helped bring that culture too, that it is still just a game, and once it's over, it's over.
And I'm thinking about you, Nate. You were there in those first years. What was that like at the beginning?
Yeah, I was fortunate to go as freshman through 4 years at Pineview High School. The freshman year was a little tricky because we didn't really have a gym to play in necessarily, so we'd go over to Washington, up to the Stake Center in Washington, and we'd practice there a couple of days, and then we'd bus over to the Armory and practice over there. But early on, Coach Lynn, along with his coaching staff, and you have to recognize his coaching staff as well, Coach Blake Pickett, Coach Rick Palmer, there was another Coach Rick Palmer, and Steve Melessa ultimately throughout there, but developed a program, a family, a unity. But yeah, it was interesting. One of the funnest times in my life was as a sophomore. 14 years old. I was younger for my age and not very big, but we were to play Dixie in the, not the Dixie Center now, but Burns Arena now, the first game ever played in there. And I remember practicing, getting ready for them, and they had a really good team. They had some phenomenal players. Brent Nyberg was playing, and some of the legends at Dixie High. But Coach Lynn challenged us. He says, this will be the first game ever played here. And if you want to be known as the first team that won here, you'll do everything you can. And Dave Rose actually was a coach at the time. I need to mention Dave. He coached for 1 year before he ended up going to the college there. And he pulled me aside and says, hey, this game's going to be won or lost on you, Nate. And I'm thinking, no way. But they instilled this sense of confidence and importance as part of the group. Ultimately, it wasn't going to be just me. It was the group. But we ended up coming out victorious that day. And then it wasn't just about that game that day. It was about Coach Lynn saying, okay, these are steps to build a program, because at some point, you're not going to be here anymore. There's going to be others that are going to follow behind you, and your job's to prepare the way for them so that they can have similar opportunities that you have. And so I felt like we were always taught to play for others. I used the term, he was building men for others. He wasn't building us for ourselves. He never, ever said, if you do this, you can become this. He always told us, if you'll do this, your buddy can become this. I remember, it's a funny story a little bit, one day in practice, he's just going after me, just yelling at me, because he knew I would respond to that. I said, Coach, I don't know that I did that. I was trying to defend myself a little bit. He says, I know you didn't, but I need to yell at you because I need to yell at somebody right now. And if others are watching me yell at you, they're going to respond. And sure enough, like wildfire, it took off. And I recognized, I wasn't the whipping boy, if you will, but I recognized what my role and my help in that with that group was. And to this day, I guess I shouldn't say to this day because he's no longer with us, but our group, we go fishing at least once a year, try to anyway, and go do things. And I've invited Coach Lynn with us. Even in his last years, he would kind of waddle up with his cane and sit in the fishing boat, and we'd tell stories and talk about old times. And if there's an individual who embodies the Dixie Spirit and the can-do attitude, it would be Coach Lynn Christensen, and his care for competitiveness, his care to make things better, but most importantly, his care for other people so that they can help other people. It wasn't, I'm going to teach you how to take care of yourself. I'm going to teach you how to take care of others. I could go on and on about going to help him haul hay for the horses and those types of outside of basketball. And I'm unique. I was a nephew to him. I wasn't his son. I was a nephew. But other players could come in here today and tell similar stories about it.
And that's true. It would be great to just have a whole line of guys walk through here and share a story each. We're putting a lot of pressure on YouTube to really tell this story today. And it does strike me that there's an interesting dynamic with both of you because you're his nephew and Jed, you're his son. And that can't be easy when you're...
I'd say Nate and I would probably sit and debate, and you could do it 10,000 times and we'd be 5,000 apiece on who thought they got picked on and yelled at and beat up the most between us. I'm sure once Dad told Nate that game was on him, that probably got passed down along, because I remember always, if we lost, it was because of me, and if we won, it wasn't because of me. But that was his motivation and his way. At the end of the day, you could ask everybody that played for him. They knew that he loved them. It didn't matter how much he screamed and yelled and whatever. 5 seconds later, he had his arm around them, and they genuinely knew that he loved them and he cared for them. Nate talks about getting to play in that Burns Arena. I think we played one of the last games in the old gym, and it happened to be against Dixie. It was a play-in game to see who would get to go to state. And it ended up being the infamous stall game. And I think I played defense in that game for about 26 out of the 32 minutes. Dixie was running a stall offense on us, and I just playing defense the entire game, and I was just like, man, this is crazy. But that whole place was just packed in there, and like I say, I believe that might have been one of the last games that was played there, and I think the reason they did that, like I said, it was a play-in game, so it couldn't be played at Dixie's gym or at Pineview's gym. It was a neutral thing, and they didn't want to have it at the Burns Arena. But really special, because I played a lot of games in there in years before that.
That's a neat bookend, because that old gym is there's so much story and history there. But how did that game turn out?
We came out on the losing end of it. But
I wondered if that was the case, Jed, because you didn't tell the rest.
Yeah, I was a junior that year, and I don't even remember for sure the score. It was really low. I think after the first quarter, it was like 3-2, something like that. And it didn't end a very high-scoring game anyways, like I say. But yeah, Dixie got the better of us on that one. But we got them back on plenty.
Speaking of gyms, and I don't think you would remember, Jed, but do you have any recall of the old gym just south of the Tabernacle?
Yeah, interestingly enough, when I think I was a seventh grader, 8th grader. Dixie High basketball team, they had a camp or something. I was picked on a team. I think Casey Bundy was playing for Dixie High at the time, and I was on his basketball team. But there was a time or two, I remember Kelly Graves and in that gym. We never played a lot in there, and I don't ever remember seeing competitions in there, but I remember playing in the one small gym that was kind of maybe an auxiliary gym, but the big gym, I remember being in there a little bit. Kelly Graves, I associate that gym with Kelly Graves for some reason. And
when you brought up the old college gym, it took me back to the original college gym. Actually, I think the original college gym was upstairs in the old Dixie building, going way, way back. But then during the 20s, they built the gym that I remember going to as a 6th, 7th grader to play, and realizing now that's where they had their games. And it was such a small, and they had a little balcony above and just a few feet of sideline for people to come. But the whole town would come to those games. And you imagine the whole town being there in that little building. And now it takes a Burns Arena. It takes everything we can find, all the amazing gyms at the high schools. But anyway, you guys were kind of part of that. You're in that transitional period from the old days of one high school to the new having two, and then it's just exponentially gone from there.
I think the thing that I want to be cautious in the conversation was that sometimes we'll leave Hurricane out of the equation a little bit too, right? Because Hurricane was here before Pineview was split, but yet then Dixie splits to Pineview, and then we have the domino effect of, I think, Snow Canyon's next, and then Desert Hills, and then Crimson. And I think it's interesting. I know when I was playing, my older brothers were part of the transition from Dixie. I think my older brother Matt was one of the first classes to be there. And it was difficult. You're separating your friends. It's almost like dividing a family. But I like to liken it into, you do. With family, sometimes you divide, you get married and move on and have more. And Coach Lynn was really passionate about the area. He wanted to beat the other schools. But more so than that, or in addition to that, he wanted to make sure the local schools competed with the northern schools. And there was a sense of familial attitude about it, even though there was competition within. And I think as time's gone on, I guess I'm going to be a little critical possibly, as time's gone on, we've separated so much and fragmented in the community to local high schools, which is great. I would love to see a day that we come back together and fill the Burns Arena so that we can beat a BYU, or as a pipe dream probably, but a local, another school, a Weber State or whatever. And we've done some of that, whether it be football, basketball, or baseball. But as we celebrate the separation that's created these sub-units of families, but we bring it back to one together because we are a community. Coach Lynn always championed that. Even though he wanted to win his piece, if he couldn't, he wanted the local teams to win.
And that's what's awesome, because you didn't win that play-in game, but Dixie went on up. I don't know how they did that year, but it does come back to that original community spirit of, we're going to beat those guys up there. And it had to do with isolation, and it had to do with perception of being down in the sticks and all of that. And yet there came that time, and it really blossomed beautifully with Coach Christensen and Pineview, where we could beat those guys up there.
I think we'll probably get into some of this, but I think so now's a good time I wanted to bring up. We talk about my group that was there at the time, and we still do things together. Matter of fact, this Christmas, we had a really special opportunity. Aunt Jeannie was in a home and wasn't doing very well necessarily, and over to Ovations and memory unit care. And we went to dinner as teammates and friends and spouses. And afterwards, we called to see if we could come Christmas caroling. And Coach Lynn was there with his wife, Jeannie, as he always took care of her, especially in the later years of their relationship there. But we went into her room, and she was laying down, and I says, Aunt Jeannie, what Christmas carol? We got one song in us. What Christmas carol do you want? And she says with a big smile on her face, will you sing that Pineview song? And we, in unison, sang the Pineview High Fight song. That's awesome. And we ended up with a more traditional Christmas carol after that. But that embodied her. She knew that's what helped define us as young men and young women, as our spouses. Interestingly enough, to this point, a few of my really good friends married special women whose fathers were very involved in Dixie High School. And so here you got, Jed talked about this earlier, I hated Dixie High. I hated Cedar High. I hated these other, because that was what I needed to do to compete, I felt like. But after you strip it all away, it was such a great community and such a great people, so warm and friendly. And here I am now. I'm married to a longtime Dixie High amazing individual, Angie Drake, whose father's Denny, who was a phenomenal player there. And we're in Snow, and we live in, I'm born in Washington. I live in Santa Clara, and I coached for Snow Canyon High for 15 years. And even then, on that note, Coach Lynn would come over to our practices, even though he was a Pineview guy through and through, or a Hurricane guy. He would come over and help Coach Brown and I, as we coached, learn how to help teach our players, our young men, how to be better and do better. And every time he would leave, the players would say, "Now, who was that again? Who's that famous guy?" And I said, "That's Coach Lynn Christensen, one of the greatest coaches of all time." You need to listen to exactly what he says.
Awesome. But Nate talks about stuff like that, and after Dad had been done coaching for a long time, you'd have coaches at Desert Hills that would say, "Hey, will you come up and talk to these kids about some stuff? And will you come watch a practice for me, see what we can do to make these boys better?" And he did it. I think probably almost all the schools around here, the coaches at the time would have him come and do that. I can even remember him, like one time he's, "Hey, come with me. We're going to go do a scouting report for so-and-so on their own team." I'm like, what? We always did scouting report on the opposite team. But he was like, he wants us to do a scouting report on them to see how they can improve, how they can be better. And he was always more than happy to go help and to do that and to make all of the community boys better. Because you've got that area down here, and we were still competing now against all those guys up there. And so if you could make these boys down here better to beat the ones up north, that was even better.
That's great. We don't have time to go through a whole blow-by-blow, play-by-play of each of your careers at Pineview, but I'd love to have each of you share maybe one or two high points. I know we're talking mainly about basketball here, of your varsity careers at Pineview that stand out most, that also relate to Coach Lynn.
I'll go first, if you don't mind. And I get emotional, and I will on this, I think, a little bit. But I was a sophomore, and this carried throughout my whole career, and it has permeated my entire life. I remember playing against a team, Carbon, and it was from Carbon County, Carbon High School. And they had an individual on the team by the name of Marcellus Cowper. Phenomenal basketball player, unbelievable. Could jump out of the gym, could do whatever he wanted to do. And Coach Lynn, as he did with me and many players, the fortunate, the Randy Reeds of the world, the Jimmy Sotos, the Durants, all these other players that have gone on and done tremendous. And I didn't really amount to much as a ball player because of my limited capabilities. But back to the story, there was a collision at half court. We were both diving for the ball, and we hit heads like no tomorrow. And that was pre-concussion conversation day. I'm certain I had one, but I remember laying on the floor in pain, and I remember the other player next to me. Coach Lynn comes out, and he says, "Get up." He says, "Get up." And I looked at him, he says, "Get up. If you get up before he does, we will win." And all I could do was think, he's asked me to get up, and he's promised me we will win, and if I get up, we're going to win. I got up, went to the bench. I think I did play a little bit more in that half, and at halftime they talked to me about shooting the shots I shoot, and I couldn't remember anything, so they said, "You're probably done for the game," because I'm sure I had a concussion, but we won that game. That lesson I have used more times than I can count in others' lives, and especially my own. Get up. If you get up before he gets up, you will win. And at the end of the day, when I see Coach Lynn again, and for that matter, his beautiful wife, Jeannie, my aunt, and especially my father, I want to say, I got up. Because we all get knocked down. I don't have that as a motto on my wall, but in my mind, it's evidently clear tremendously. Get up before he does, and we will win. So
that's awesome. And you were a sophomore that year. How did you do?
So as a sophomore there, we were pretty good. We won the region championship 3 straight years. We ended up, I think, taking 7th in the state. Our junior year, we took 4th in the state. Now, we were playing with the Timpviews and the Juan Diego's of the school. We actually, our semifinal game, we had taken a charge on a play that should have been called a charge, and we would have had the ball back, and we would have beaten Mountain Crest. Yeah, Jed remembers that vividly. We would have beaten Mountain Crest, then we would have played in the state championship against, I think it was Quincy Lewis and Tim Few, and who knows how that would have ended up. But we ended up losing that game on a controversy. I won't say whether the officials were wrong or right, but we lost.
Was Grandma Karma there?
She wasn't at the game, no.
I just wondered what her call was.
She would have definitely been on our side, and she was always right. Anyway, we lost that. So we were 4th in the state that year and then 7th the next year, and so we were competitive.
So those years, you're getting rolling as a school and as a team and really playing well and getting close.
Yeah. Real quick, to tell a story, I seen a young man that had a T-shirt on, as a Pineview High basketball T-shirt, and the region championship started in 1984 or 85 or 6 or something, and ended in about 2001. And I said, that's a great-looking shirt. I says, where'd you get that? He says, he was proud of the Pineview High basketball program. And I said, you know what's unique about the start dates and end dates? And he says, what's that? I says, that first date is the date when Coach Lynn took over with our group, and I was a sophomore, and we started winning games. And I said, the 2001 was the last time that I wasn't associated with Pineview, and I started becoming associated with Snow Canyon. We started winning over there. Egotistical comment there a little bit. But Coach Lynn, he developed a program, and he was always a winner.
And now we jump forward, 6, 7, 8 years?
No, actually, just only a couple. I was a sophomore when...
Oh, that's right. You're a sophomore.
When Nate was a senior.
I was making you younger.
Now, Jed won't tell this. Maybe he will, but I'm going to tell it for him just a little bit. I remember him having to play against Sean Bradley at home, wasn't it? And it was, and Jed, I don't know if the listeners understand how tall Jed is, but he's a 5'5"?
Maybe all of 5'10".
5'10". But he was trying to guard Sean Bradley, and it was actually quite intriguing to watch the strategy that was taking place to try to defeat this team. But go ahead.
You talk about that, but how many times did Dad have, you had Dave Worthington guarding Jason Hurst? Yep. Dave couldn't have been 5'9", 140 pounds soaking wet, and Jason Hurst was an unbelievable player at Dixie at, 6'6", 6'7", or something. And just his strategies he would do with different things like that and whatever. But anyway, yeah, so I was a sophomore when Nate was a senior, and I grew up with him down on the farm doing stuff. So he was always like a big brother to me. I didn't have a big brother. But that class of those seniors learned so much from those guys. They had such a phenomenal team. 8, 9 seniors you guys had on that team. So there wasn't a lot of playing time on that group when I was a sophomore. I started as a junior and a senior. But like I say, they had so much talent on that team, that varsity season when they were seniors. But you talk about, I've got tons of different memories of things, but stuff Nate talks about with not being defeated and get up. They may be one of the first years that I kind of remember it, but then I know it went for years after. But we used to always have to run ladders after practice or different things, and had to do them in a certain amount of time. If the entire team didn't finish it, you had to run it again or whatever. And if you didn't get it under the time, you ran it again. And I can remember times when guys are ripping their shirts off, and you will not get us. We'll run these for as long as you want us to run them, and we'll run through a brick wall if that's what it takes. But I think that's some of what he instilled in all of the players as well, was, like Nate said, just that attitude of get up, you're not defeated. And like I said, we'd run those things forever, and if we didn't finish them, you just kept running them, and you kept running them, and you kept running them. But it was like I said, guys ripping shirts off and screaming and yelling, and eventually, yeah, we got them done.
Real quick, I think this goes without saying, a lot of people would notice the on-court either behavior or strategies or competitiveness or whatever. I think what needs to be relayed, the message a little bit as well, is the things that took place before that. And I think that's one thing that I'll always take away from him. He was always prepared. He knew the other team. He almost knew the other team better than the other team knew themselves. And the message in that was the preparation. One thing that became a tradition, at least while we were there, because of his tutelage, was the word of the day. We would gather before practice in a classroom in our practice uniforms, and we had a notebook that he had given it to us. And we were to write down the word of the day. Whatever that word would be, he'd define it. And he'd ask players, what does this mean to you? And what does this mean to you? And to this day, I talk to players who look at their word of the day book. And matter of fact, I think his son-in-law, who married Jed's sister Joy, who tragically passed away because of an illness, referenced the day. I can't remember the word was the day Coach Lynn passed away, but referenced the word of the day and that lasting impact. It wasn't, at the end of the day, we weren't defined by the state championships we won. Maybe we could have won more, or maybe should have won more at times, but we were defined on, again, the fact that he was building men, because he coached the boys, building men for others. And again, to liken this back to the Dixie Spirit, that's what the Dixie Spirit is. It's not selfish. It's selfless. It's serving others. It's helping them be better. It's deflecting attitudes and accolades or whatever so that everybody can benefit from it. And he was notorious for that. And I'm remiss to say that I'm not as good at it as I need to be. And moving forward, we needed constant reminders to be better about that. And I'm grateful, Lyman, for the opportunity to have this conversation and what you're doing. I don't know how many people are listening in totality behind this, but if one can listen, then two can listen, then more can listen. And if we can recapture or continue to promote that not forgotten Dixie Spirit, then the world becomes a better place, little bit by little bit. And that was what Coach Lynn was about.
Nate was talking about that Dixie Spirit and the selfless. I've had a lot of people tell me, I remember a young man that played for Dad. He was younger than I was, but he had, I don't remember now if he had broken arm or a leg. I think it was his leg. But he said, Coach, you were the only one that came to visit me in the summer the entire time when I had this broken leg. All these other teachers, all these other stuff. And Dad took the time out of the day to do that. He was always stopping kids on the road through the summer to talk to them and see what they were doing. Another one that was one of Nate's really good friends and played with him, and a really good friend of my sister. But Dad stopped him one day driving his truck down, and how he happened to know or whatever, but just talked to him about maybe going to play baseball versus going on a mission and the different things. And like I say, he was always trying to make better men out of them. The athletic stuff was never really, it was a part of it at the time, but that's not what all of it was about. It was about making a better individual. Another one that he had told a kid, hey, you're probably good enough to make the team, but you're probably not going to get to play much, but I think you should do this. The kid ends up being the class president, and to this day, he talks about that was the best decision and the best advice your dad gave me. Every time I see him, he talks about that. And there's countless stories like that of him helping somebody, and like I say, never necessarily about the athletics. It was about making you a better person.
You're not going to get us to stop here for a minute. I apologize, Lyman. I know this is your show, but real quick, I want to say one thing here. I know there's going to be people that listen to this. I know there's a lot of people that listen to it, and there's going to be some saying, yeah, that ain't the Coach Lynn I knew. He ain't no saint. And I want to comment on that. Coach Lynn would be the first to tell you that he wasn't a saint. He would be the first to admit that there were challenges in his life and obstacles to overcome, but he'd also be the first to tell you, you don't have to be a saint to do the right thing. And I think as we tell stories and talk about that, it helps me appreciate that people think I'm not good enough to do that, or he wasn't that kind of a guy, or he was, even though maybe it would come off not as a saint, or maybe he even would swear sometimes at the officials, or the officials would, because I know there's a lot of officials that'll listen to this and say, that's not the guy I knew. But yet, even though he wasn't technically a saint, if you will, in terms of that aura, he taught me that you don't have to be. Be good, do right, be the best you can, battle through, overcome. And he did. He always did.
I love how you stated that Nate. And as you were saying that, I was agreeing because I understand the nuances of all of this. But at the same time, in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, but he was married to a saint. Oh, yeah. And maybe we could just talk a minute about Jeannie and what she means in this whole story.
Well, 100%. Mom was Dad's biggest supporter. Behind the scenes, she was there for him all the time. And she loved to see him in his career, to help him in his career. But she truly drove him.
But she was a champion in her own right, in all that she pursued.
She was, and she didn't ever like any of the accolades. She was an unbelievable athlete, class president.
Dixie Roundup Queen.
Dixie Roundup Queen. I don't know how many times you'll ever see somebody on a horse on the grounds of the temple. I think it only happened once and probably not ever happen again. But yeah, she was a phenomenal athlete in her own right. A few individuals that were classmates with her talked and said she was the glue that held that class together. I don't know what year, for sure what class year that was, but she was. She was 100% a saint, and people would say all the time, I don't know how you can live with that guy. I do not know how you can live with that guy.
That's what made her a saint.
Yes. I remember often going down by the house, and she always had bottled peaches, and she always had dried fruit. And she always did things that made you remember where you came from, the roots of your ancestors, to say, or kept you grounded. I loved hearing her yoo-hoo when you go into homes or things like that to see who's there. And you never really would knock. You'd open the door and yoo-hoo. But she was always there. And if you wanted Coach Lynn to go do something and he wasn't quite anxious to do it, she'd say, Coach, or Dad, or however she referred to him, Lynn, go. And he would get up and he would go. Not very many times would he do that unless he was asked by Aunt Jeannie. But she is just an angel. She was humble. She served others. She took time when Coach was gone, helping raise other individuals, other players, and took time to raise her children. And it's evident, by their fruits you shall know them. You look at the children that Coach Lynn and Aunt Jeannie have raised and the quality of individuals that they are and the contributions they make to the community. And it's not by chance. It's because she embodied, I guess if I'll end with in this comment about her, she embodied the word mother. She, selfless hours, didn't sleep a lot at times, always concerned about the neighbors, always concerned about her own children, other players, other coaches' wives, other coaches. Very seldom did I ever see Aunt Jeannie ever do much for herself, excepting making sure she had a lot of Pepsi. She always had enough Pepsi, I think, to go. And I will say this. I think that Aunt Jeannie, she wore out in doing service to others. And if there's a way to wear out, that's the way to wear out.
I'm the kind of the old guy here, and I have the 30,000-foot view, even above both of you, because I see where Jeannie came from. It was from her mom. And I know where Karma, her mom, came from, because I knew Jeannie's grandma, Karma's mother, Orilla Woods Hafen. And you just see that come down through the generations, the kind of mothers that they were, the families that they raised, the good that they did, and the really eternal consequences of their sacrifices.
Yeah, I think of Aunt Jeannie, and I guess the best way to liken it is, and maybe I'm making this up somewhat, but early pioneers coming across, whether they were members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints or other religions or whatever it was, the pioneers that really made a difference were the ones that said, you know what, we're planting and we're not going to harvest until we get to the next place. And maybe if someone ahead of us has planted, we'll harvest. That's how Aunt Jeannie lived her life. She planted, and she loved to garden too. And she harvested some vegetables and things like that. But her whole life was spent planting. And the next generation is the generation that's able to harvest what Aunt Jeannie's planted. And I think a disappointing thing would be to Aunt Jeannie, if she was to be able to be asked at this time, if the next generation or generations are not continuing to plant for those to come. And I look back on our community, and I think we're going through periods of that a little bit, that everything generational wealth, if you would, we have, I'm hoping that our generation will add back so that other generations can have. But about Aunt Jeannie, that's what she was. It was never about herself.
I don't mean to overstate this, but the two of you represent that next generation of planting and giving back in your own modern way. It's different now, but what you're doing, what you've done and what you're doing, and the families that you're raising are continuing that. And we could go on and on about this, but we've been talking about a legendary coach, but we haven't been worried about how many state championships he won, which, by the way, do we know?
One.
Okay.
And Hurricane's proud of that one, and they should be.
They're extremely proud of it.
But we could share all kinds of statistics of victory and of overcoming and of winning. But what we've really been talking about today is character and building character and really defining what we're referring to as the Dixie Spirit.
I will say, and I think it's been interwoven maybe even with what I've been saying, not in a promotional way for you, Lyman, but in general, the work that you're doing, I think, I'm hoping that it gets outside of maybe a certain group of individuals who think that they just embody the Dixie Spirit, because this Dixie Spirit that you teach so eloquently and that we talk about and that we've, over the last handful of years with transitions of university status and all these other things that get political, strip that all away, this unique spirit that you talk about can be and should be magnified and multiplied into homes throughout our area, throughout the entire world. And I think if you really get deep down into it, there's a lot of this. They call it maybe a different type of a spirit. And I'm not even going to get on a religious plane. I'm just talking about the attitude of can do and work and overcome. And to champion your cause and with what's going on with this, identifying some of those characteristics and individuals who have embodied that, I hope that we can continue to do that and continue to teach that. I know my children need to be taught. As I have grandchildren, they need to be taught. And hopefully that continues to catch and go quickly through the homes.
Thank you.
And to echo on to what Nate said there, I mean, I know how much Mom and Dad truly love this area and the Dixie Spirit. You know, as the community continues to get bigger and bigger, I mean, it just continues to grow, and it's not going to stop. But it is so important that we do help those understand and to carry on that Dixie Spirit, that selflessness, that I'll take my shirt off my back and give it to you kind of attitude, because that's what this area was built on.
Jed, that's so beautifully stated. And it's heartening because there are many people who are listening to this podcast and who are learning to become adopted into this community and who truly want to. They don't want to just move here. They want to become a part. And all of us came here at some point and became a part of it. And there's no reason why, just as you expressed, Nate, why someone moving here today can't embrace and feel and be blessed by this same spirit that we're talking about. You guys, you're awesome. This has been a blast. It's so good to visit with you. I say a blast, and yet we've talked about some really things that are tender to the heart, but to be able to celebrate Coach Lynn and Jeannie and that whole spirit that they represent. Thank you.
We appreciate it. This has been
a pleasure to be here.
The Doc Booth Foundation is dedicated to empowering individuals through educational opportunities and promoting mental health advocacy. Through scholarships and funding for important community needs, the foundation perpetuates the can-do spirit of the founders of this community, using the lessons of the past to chart the course for a better future. Make your tax-deductible donation at docboothfoundation.org. Not Forgotten is produced by Ricky Valadez and made possible by the generous support of St. George Area Zag Stores, industry-leading tech support, and accessories. Lyman Hafen's books can be found at lymanhafen.com.
Once I lived in Cottonwood and owned a little farm. When they called me down to Dixie, it caused me much alarm. To hoe the cane and cotton, I right away must go. But the reason why they sent me, I'm sure I do not know. We came to Dixie, and we called it home. Oh, in Dixie, we've lived and grown. But the reason why they sent me, I'm sure I do not know. The hot winds whirl around me and take away my breath. I've had the chills and fever till I'm nearly shook to death. All earthly tribulations are but a moment here. And oh, if I prove faithful, a righteous crown I'll wear. We came to Dixie, and we called it home. Oh, in Dixie, we've lived and grown. But the reason why they sent me, I'm sure I do not know. I hope that there's a heaven with rivers pure and clean. But I know that there are others who will come here after me. Though I may never see it as a garden lined with trees. If this desert's gonna blossom, I'd bet